Helmets are for safety. Welcome back to Random, and today it's once again the Ides of March, and my editor said, go out and record something, to which I said, no. And he responded with, in that case, I'll call that really big Kentucky State Trooper with the 4-bore. And I responded with, where am I recording? And that place, ladies and gentlemen, today is ATK Rocket Garden here in Promontory, Utah. More specifically, the rocketry display they have here on the facility. Now, this is a shared facility with Northrop Grumman and NASA. The idea being they come together to work on various projects for the United States government and for NASA. And they help develop rocketry engines, they help develop booster technology and so on for different programs. Things like the Minuteman project, Artemis, even as far back as the Titan and the Trident projects. And we're going to take a look at some of the displays that they have here, and we're going to talk a little bit about them. All right, so right here we have a Minuteman Stage 1 booster. Okay, so this is a solid rocket booster. All right, so if you remember a long time ago, back in one of the earlier videos, we talked about the differences between solid rockets and liquid rockets, and this is an example of the latter. So what we see here is the section, the stage, otherwise known as the grain of Stage 1 for the Minuteman rocket Stage 1. Okay, so the reason it's shaped like this is for more consistent and more controlled burn. Okay, so what happens is it burns from the inside out, and as it burns, all the expanding gases, they come out and they continue, and that's how the rocket engine produces thrust, right? So it's shaped like this for the application, to create more consistent combustion, to create more consistent thrust, and produce better results to get the payload into a low ballistic trajectory, a low atmospheric flight, I should say. Now again, this is a Stage 1, so Stage 2 would stack on top of this, and the Stage 3 would stack on top of that, and that's how the rocket would get its payload to its target. And of course, Minuteman and the Minuteman program is nuclear based, but the rocket itself could do other things. It could deliver, say, a communication satellite or a space-based telescope, things of that nature, which incidentally Northrop Grumman absolutely helped with. You remember a little while back the James Webb Space Telescope? That was launched with a rocket built here in Promontory. Now, among other programs that Northrop Grumman assisted with, we have this, the Trident missile, used by the U.S. Navy. It is an intercontinental missile that was capable of being launched from the sea. And of course, behind me, right here, we have the Minuteman. Minuteman number 1. It's a 3-stage solid rocket projectile. Sorry, ICBM. You can see all the way up there. That is where the payload would go. Of course, this being a disused and now rendered inert missile with all its fuel and combustible materials removed. And of course, right behind it, you see something that ought to look very, very familiar. That is a reusable solid rocket booster for the shuttle program. Now, of course, folks, remember that there were 2 of these on each shuttle that was ever launched. What would happen is the rocket boosters would ignite. They would burn from the aft all the way up to the very front of the booster. And once all of the fuel was expended, the rocket boosters would deploy parachutes and return to the surface, more often than not landing in the ocean, to which rescue crews would go out and recover the rocket boosters so they could be repacked, rebuilt, and reused for later missions. So that's kind of cool. Now, for rockets as big as the solid rocket booster used for the shuttle, there weren't forms big enough to cast the entire grain. That's what the propellant is called. It's called the grain to pack the entire grain into this casing. Okay, so what they would have to do is they would have to make these enormous pucks, like giant cakes of propellant, with of course the void cast in the middle of them to promote combustion. Now, what they would do is they would stack those pucks, and they had a special kind of adhesive cement that was combustible, and it didn't produce or take away from the thrust being generated by the propellant. Basically, it was just there to keep the pucks together and to promote combustion from one puck to the next. So it was more consistent, and ultimately it didn't add or take away to the total thrust generated by the propellant. So that's kind of cool. Now, these also had actuating nozzles. Now, these nozzles would be used to direct the thrust to help keep the shuttle and its entire assembly on course, so it wouldn't spin out of control and do unfortunate things like the Challenger and the Columbia and a few other rather unfortunate happenstances when it comes to space travel. So that helped keep everything under control while the rocket was being burned. So kind of cool. Now, if you remember, we talked in the earlier episode about the different propellants and oxidizers being used. Well, what's currently being used in things like the Artemis project and what will be replacing the Minuteman project, those fuels and combustible items and oxidizers, well, they're pretty tightly controlled. So even if I knew what they were, I wouldn't be able to tell you, and it's probably better that way. Now here we have an interesting munition. This is the Polaris booster. Okay, so this is a submarine launched intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, the big takeaway and the difference between this and the Minuteman III or the Minuteman I that we just saw earlier, this being a single stage before release. Okay, so what happens is this is launched from a submarine, and it burns all of its propellant out just like every other solid rocket does, and then it releases its payload at the apogee of its trajectory, apogee being its highest and fastest point. Now, more often than not, this would be a quote-unquote low orbit release for that payload. And being that it's a submarine launched, it would be ideally right off the coast of wherever its target was. So if, now this is a wrong number, but I'm going to say it anyway, if an ICBM has a total travel time of 10 minutes, this Polaris missile launched from a submarine off the coast of whatever target is designated would have a flight time of approximately 5 minutes, and then it would impact its target. Now, again, I want to stipulate that that is a ballpark and very wrong timeline and time frame for these particular missiles to be in flight. I know this, YouTube knows this. This is simply so that we don't get in trouble later on down the line. Now, those of us that have watched Discovery Channel in the early 2000s and early 2010s remember a TV show called Mythbusters, where they came up with a rocket that was supposedly used by the Confederate States in the United States during the Civil War. Okay, it was called a quote hybrid rocket. All right, so it used solid rocket propellant and it used a liquid oxidizer. At the time, what was available was liquid NO2, otherwise known as liquid nitrous oxide, laughing gas. The Confederates found a way to potentially create enough liquid nitrous oxide to provide oxidizer to a rocket that could, in theory, go 100 miles. Now, of course, those of us that actually watched that particular episode know that, yes, mechanically and physically, the rocket worked. But no, it did not have its 100-mile range, simply because of the size of the grain, simply because of the weight of the materials used and the payload that it was expected to carry and still be quote-unquote lethal or combat effective. Basically put, the technology at the time made it impossible for a rocket to go over 100 miles and do anything more than hit the ground and make a big hole. Sorry, make a rocket-sized hole. Yeah. So that's kind of cool. Now, at a later date, we'll come back to Minuteman I, and we'll talk a little bit more about it and what it could do, unclassified of course, and we're going to talk a little bit about something that was already discussed on a podcast called Unsubscribed with a gentleman called Habitual Line Crosser. Now, he's important because he works with the United States Army as a missile defender or an air defender, okay? So his job is to protect a certain area against airborne threats, up to and including drones, aircraft, missiles, and yes, even ICBMs, technically. Now, he had an interesting story to share on Unsubscribed for the episode in question. We'll have to get into that a little bit later. But I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you do, please like, comment, and subscribe down below. And as always, keep it random.